Welcome to the Acts 2:42 podcast. Today we're talking about Zechariah Chapter 9. As we move through this book, we have completed, if you will, the second section of the book, and here Chapter 9 begins the third. We don't have a timeline as far as when this happens, but we just find that the burden of the word of the Lord, or the oracle of the word of the Lord, it says, is against the land of Hadrach, with Damascus as its resting place. For the eyes of men, especially of all the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord. We don't know what Hadrach is. There's comments from ancient Syria, I guess, where somebody wrote down and said, "Let it be known to all people at all time that I witness there is a land of Hadrach, and I have seen it with my own eyes." And there is a city called Hadrach, which is near Damascus. It says, with Damascus as its resting place. There is a place that is there. And my suspicion, because nobody has a definitive thought on this, but my suspicion is that for some reason Hadrach was a place that many Jews settled in. I have no basis for that aside from what we find in the scriptures here. As far as I know, aside from that early reference, I'm not aware of any reference to Hadrach anywhere else. So Hadrach did exist. It was a city, and it apparently, or seems to have been destroyed after the conquest of Alexander the Great. But this is the burden of the Lord against that land of Hadrach. Now, my just assumption, because of what it says next, the eyes of men, especially of all the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord, is that this was a place where there was a lot of Jews. And so this message that the Lord is about to give to Zechariah specifically concerns it and all the other places that he's about to list. It says, and Hamath also, which borders on it. But it was specifically for these places, and it was a message that God was giving to them. So Zechariah wrote this down. I presume he either took it in person or sent a message to these people, most likely the Jews that lived in this area. Now, I think we might have said last week, Zechariah is kind of the prophet that calls the people back to the land of Israel. He says, the 70 years are over, you need to come back. And this is part of that call. This is an oracle, and the Lord is calling. We're going to find in this chapter, he makes a direct call to the people. No beating around the bush, if you will. The Lord directly calls them to come back. But what had happened, it seems what had happened, is that there were a significant number of Jews after Cyrus said, you guys can all, go back to the land of Israel, that they did go somewhere, but they didn't go back to the land of Israel. And I suspect many of them settled in this land of Hadrach and Hamath, which borders on it, near Damascus. They could benefit from the city of Damascus and do trade and everything there, but they could kind of live separate outside in this little place called Hadrach and Hamath. So in any case, this is a word of the Lord to these people. And what does the Lord have to say? Well, it is very interesting. He says, Hamath also, which borders on it, Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise, Tyre built herself a fortress and piled up silver like dust and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea, and she will be consumed with fire. And he goes on from there. Now, okay, think about this for a minute. Why, if you're a Jew and Cyrus says you can leave Babylon and go back to the land of Israel and rebuild a house, why would you go to Hadrach? Why would you go to Tyre and Sidon? He's going to get to Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and these other places as well, Ashdod. Why would you go there? Well, I think the answer, there could be a lot of answers, but the most simple answer is that Jerusalem was a wasteland. There was no city in Jerusalem. In the previous chapter, the Lord references how up until that point, he said there wasn't any wage to be made. Even if you had an animal, you couldn't make money in Jerusalem. But in Damascus, boy, you could make money in Damascus. You could in Tyre, you could in Sidon, you could in Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod. These were all cities in this day. They were places where you could have commerce, a lot of commerce. And so I hope I'm not assuming too much, but I don't think I am. I believe that these Jews decided not to go back to the land of Jerusalem, but to go to these other places because there were opportunities, financial opportunities. You're weighing the options. If you will, say, I can go back and live in absolute poverty where I can't find a job and try to eke out an existence out of an earth that doesn't want to give any food, or I can go to Hadrach, trade and have my business in Damascus and, do very well and have a nice, comfortable home. Well, what is the Lord going to do about that? Well, let me read a quote from William Kelly. And this is what he writes. William Kelly writes, this is from his lecture on the Minor Prophets, page 469. He says, quote, "As to the early verses of the chapter, there seems no reason to question that they distinctly apply to the march of Alexander's army and the heavy blows struck north and south of Judea after the Battle of Issus, as well as certain successes of the Jews long afterwards over Greeks, and above all, to Jehovah's then protection of his house when the conqueror of the east passed by on his return westward to secure the coasts of the Mediterranean, etc., etc." And then he says, even rationalists admit the exact parallel between the list of his captured and the places which gave him especial trouble in besieging them, as Tyre and Gaza, as well as the long subsequent Maccabean victories. End quote. He goes on to say that it prefigures the king of the north in the future attacks. Anstey says, quote, "We are not aware of these things having any end-time application," end quote. Kind of, if you know Bruce Anstey at all, that's quite an admission. Here we are, and we're in Zechariah chapter 9, and these Jews have settled in all these areas aside from Jerusalem, and the Lord wants them to come back to himself, to his city, to himself, and they're in all these other places, and essentially what he says is, it is not safe for you to be there. You need to leave. All right, as we go through this, and I don't want to take a huge amount of time, but it is vastly interesting to me as someone who, enjoys history. And I'm going to assume that if you are listening to this podcast on Zechariah 9, you have some love for history as well. So I am going to take a little bit of time, and if it ends up taking too long, I'll maybe split this into 1 and 2, I don't know, or A and B. But I want to go through and show what Kelly writes of as the exact parallels. Okay, I'm assuming everybody knows who Alexander the Great is. He's, if you're ranking military generals of all time, he's top 5. A lot of people would put him number 1 or 2. He's incredible. He's prophesied of a lot. Incredible in the sense of his military prowess. He comes through, attacks Persia, which at the time of writing this in Zechariah 9 was a couple hundred years. I don't want to get my numbers wrong, but it was, I think, at least 100 years in the future. And I think it was closer to 200 years in the future, 150, 200 years, when Zechariah is writing this. But Zechariah prophesies that this is going to happen. There is going to come a conqueror, and he is going to go through. Okay, so now let's just break it down. It says, Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise, for Tyre built herself a fortress and piled up silver like dust and gold like the mire of the street. Okay, let's read. I'm going to read this is from Alexander the Great by Philip Freeman. I'm going to summarize it just a little bit. essentially, Tyre, it says Tyre was an incredible fortress. It was built on an island with walls set at the water's edge. Alexander the Great in 332 BC conquered Tyre. Alexander blockaded and sieged the city for 7 months. He then built a mole. A mole is like a causeway, we would call it, out to the city, attacked it with battering ram, breached the wall, entered the city. Some 6,000 were killed, then another 2,000 crucified. He destroyed half the city, presumably by fire, and sold 30,000 into slavery. And he goes on. Now, I just want to reference how high these walls were. So you could, look this up on Wikipedia, but there's other references as well. These walls were 150 feet high. All right, that's really high. All right, that's like a 15-story building. That's really, really tall. Now, people have said, well, it depends on where you measured. It was kind of off of the river bottom, or things like that. Well, regardless of however you slice it, they were 150 feet high. I don't know how thick they were. I seem to remember reading somewhere, but I don't know, and I don't have it written down. But just for a point of comparison, Ashkelon at this time had walls that were 50 feet high and 150 feet thick. I mean, that just staggers the imagination. But that's just kind of was the building practice at this time. They had siege weapons, battering rams, things like that. And you just had to build massive walls to avoid, being able to or be able to last out a long attack. And 150 feet thick and 50 feet high was what Ashkelon thought would do it. And if the walls at Tyre were 150 feet high and it was on an island to begin with, the statement in the scriptures, Tyre built herself a fortress, is absolutely true. And then it says, piled up silver like dust and gold like the mire of the streets. Tyre had harbors, and it was, I don't know how much we know of ancient history, and I'm not all that super familiar with the with all of trade and everything else, but I understand that Tyre was like the major hub of trade for that kind of entire area. All right, so it had silver like the dust and gold like the mire of the streets. Now, Tyre had the fortress, which was on the island, but then the town itself, or the majority of the town, or I don't know what percentage was, but at least a town where I think most people lived, was on the mainland. And then it was, I can't remember exactly how far, it was like a mile or something like that, between the mainland and the city. They had a very well-developed navy, and they were in a very good position. Now, Alexander the Great arrived. Sidon it references Sidon here. Sidon had a very impressive fortress as well. Sidon just surrendered to them. And they showed up Alexander's army showed up at Tyre, and he demands to be able to do the sacrifice and everything else. And the Tyrians, if that's the right Tyranians, I don't know, but the Tyrians, the people of Tyre, mocked the Greeks and even executed some of their soldiers on top of those city walls. Well, Alexander was infuriated and determined that he was going to capture this fortress. And I mean, a bunch of the people were thinking, this is impossible. I mean, it's a mile out over the water. We don't have a navy to speak of. How are we going to get there? And then Alexander, picks up this rock and goes and throws it into the water and tells his army to do the same. And they start building this mole, or essentially this causeway out there. Well, they make it most of the way across. And the Tyrians are just mocking them from this 150-foot high wall and laughing at them and hindering the work too. But they finally get most of the way across, and then they find that it just turns into this really deep channel. It was pretty shallow for that portion, the water was, and then it gets really deep. And so now what do you do? Well, he had these massive siege engines. I think they were 160 feet high, so they could actually get over the wall. He had them rolled out, and they started lobbing stones into the city. But then the the Tyrians sent a fire ship, and that got all burned and everything else. Well, eventually, this took Alexander something like, I think it was 7 months. But to capture a fortress like that in just 7 months, he eventually did go up and he got a navy, and he was able to capture it with a navy, got a battering ram and everything else. And he eventually burned the city because of what they had done. And he crucified 2,000 people. If you can imagine what crucifying 2,000 people looks like, it's horrific, but he destroys the city. Well, that's the story. That's what happened. This is a very, very famous battle from this time. A lot of references to it. Any book on Alexander talks about this in some detail. It was one of his more famous battles because, again, it just seemed impossible. And then 7 months later, it's just gone. It's just wiped off the face of the earth. And that's exactly what it says here. It says, "Behold, the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea, and she will be consumed with fire." Alexander burned it. And then as far as casting her wealth into the sea, there could be a couple different interpretations, but here is a very interesting thing that was pointed out to me. The people took this, they had the city, the mainland city, if you will, where I'm imagining they had a lot of their wealth and everything, and all their houses and whatever else. They took that, and that's what they used to make the causeway to get out there. So in a very literal way, their wealth was cast into the sea, not like some figurative way. Literally, their houses and their property, all their wealth was cast into the sea. I don't imagine that, the Greeks actually threw gold into the sea, but still, their wealth was cast into the sea. And Tyre was conquered. It says Ashkelon will see it and will be afraid. Gaza too will writhe in great pain. Now, these are cities, as it says, that gave Alexander, we could say maybe, trouble. Ashkelon, as I think I already mentioned this, it had walls 50 feet high and 150 feet thick, and Alexander marches on it. There isn't a whole lot of details about what happens there, but there is reference that it was defeated. I don't know how long the battle was or whatever else. It really references the fear that Ashkelon had more than great pain. But when we come to Gaza, it says, Gaza too will writhe in great pain. And it says the king will perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon will not be inhabited. And it also references Ekron, which Alexander, I assume, also conquered. Gaza was kind of another, it was a much less famous battle, but it also had very high walls. And Battis was the name of the man who was kind of the military general or king or whatever of the city. And he famously refuses to give in. Basically everybody in the area is cowering in fear after they learn that Tyre is destroyed. And here he comes to Gaza and he says, it's not possible to build mounds against it because it's fortifications, the way it was situated on I think it was on a hill or something like that. But that's exactly what Alexander did. It doesn't even take him that long, and he destroys Gaza. And then this Battis fellow refuses to bow down to Alexander and I don't know, give him the credit that he should have, surrender the sword, shall we say. And so I won't say what Alexander did to him, but he did something very horrible to him. And so it references the king will perish from Gaza and Ashkelon will not be inhabited. Well, I want to move along, but I just hope that is clear that here, hundreds of years beforehand, this prophecy of what's going to happen to these places where the people that should be in Jerusalem were, is given by the Lord as encouragement and direction for them to come back. He references the mongrel race and etc. But here's the key. After all of that, he says, but I will camp around my house because of an army, because of him who passes by and returns. Now, Jerusalem, as we've kind of said, was a bit of a wasteland. It wasn't some big city at this time, but it still is significant that Alexander does not go and conquer Jerusalem. Now, we have the account of the high priest, and I mentioned this when we talked about Daniel. He was very, very afraid because Alexander was on the way. He just destroyed Tyre, and Alexander had previously sent to Jerusalem to get troops and assistance for his battle with Tyre, and the people of Jerusalem refused to give it, so they were very afraid that now he's marching. And there's no reference in apparently very many of the old documents, but these old documents, and Josephus records that he does go to Jerusalem, but not to destroy it. And that's when he, the priest goes out and talks to him about, look, here you are, you're prophesied. And Alexander worships in the temple and gives the Jewish people, peace, if you will. Well, that is what is prophesied of here. I will encamp around my house because of an army, because of him who passes by and returns. Alexander did go down. He goes down to Egypt, conquers Egypt, and then he comes back. Now, the next statement can be troubling. He says, and no oppressor will pass over them anymore, for now I have seen with my eyes. But the way I take this is, this verse is split, if you will, or it's looking on, because the very next sentence is, rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion, shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on the colt, the foal of a donkey. And he talks about how he's going to cut off war. He cut off the horse from Jerusalem. The bow of war will be cut off. He'll speak peace to the nations. His dominion will be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. This is the prophecy of the Messiah. And I take it that, as we often see in these prophecies, there's a jump. And I believe it happens in verse 8 when he's finished talking about Alexander, and he goes on and he reminds the people, so he's just said, get out of these places, come back to the land. But now he very directly tells them that there's going to be safety there, and this is the Messiah, and this is where peace is going to emanate from. So they should come back to Jerusalem. And now he's going to basically directly say that. So as we move on, he says, as for you also, now he's speaking directly to the Jews that are in Hadrach and Hamath and all these other places. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to the strongholds, O prisoners who have the hope. This very day I am declaring that I will restore double to you. Now, this here is a direct, and I think maybe the most direct in the whole book that I can think of anyway. It's a very direct command to these people. The Lord is saying, I want you to come back. He says, I set your prisoners free from the waterless pit, from that, I take it, that place where there is no sustenance. He set them free just like they were released, if you will, by Cyrus. And he says, I want you to return to the stronghold, O prisoners who have the hope, those who trust in the words of the Lord. And he says, this very day I'm declaring I will restore double to you. And this goes along with what I was saying earlier. Why did they not return to begin with? Well, I think it was because of the opportunities that they had in these other lands, in Damascus and in Tyre and Sidon and all these other places. But the Lord is saying here, I will restore double to you. He's saying, leave it behind. Leave your business behind. Leave all these things behind. Come back to the stronghold, that's Jerusalem, and I will give you double. And then he says, I will bend Judah as my bow. I will fill the bow with Ephraim. I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and etc. And the Lord of hosts will defend them. Again, he again reminds them, there is this future. Remember, I have a future. You are to come back to this stronghold, and eventually forces are going to march out of Judah and conquer the surrounding areas. And here he references by name, O Greece. Now, why? You would think, why? Greece was nothing at this time. The battles, all the famous battles of Marathon and all of that, they hadn't happened at this time. This was in the reign of Darius. Those wouldn't happen until, I think it's the next king, or maybe it's 2 kings later. I think it's the next king, though. I think it's Xerxes. But in any case, these had not happened yet. And so why would he reference, O Greece? Well, I believe it's a direct reference to what he's been talking about earlier. Alexander was a Greek. And so here he references, I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece. Now again, we have this kind of prefiguring of the days of the Maccabees, and Kelly and Anstey both reference that. But Kelly says, look, this cannot be fulfilled completely in the days of the Maccabees. This has to be something that looks on. But surely it was in part fulfilled during the days of the Maccabees. But it is true that there is this future. The Lord of hosts will defend these people. He will go over them. It says his arrow will go forth like lightning. And it says the Lord will appear over them. I mean, this did not happen, so far as I know, in the days of the Maccabees, but it will happen in a future day. And it says, it ends with, the Lord their God will save them in that day as the flock of his people. They are the stones of a crown, sparkling in his land. For what comeliness and beauty will be theirs. Grain will make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins. So the message is very simple. He says, I let you free. I want you to come back to the stronghold. That's where I am. That's where power is going to be. And I'm going to give you double for whatever you leave behind in all these other lands. And all these other lands are going to be destroyed anyways. Don't think that you're safe there. You're not. Come back to Jerusalem. Come back to the stronghold. And then I will defend you. And so, just to take a quick minute and make a practical application to us. Is our heart and is our focus on the things of this world, on living near Damascus, say, or a Tyre or a Sidon, which we know very well is going to be destroyed in a future day? Or is our heart to be where the Lord is? He says, I will restore double to you. And we know he will restore much more than double for all of our labor and service for him. So we should not be like the Jews. We should respond to the Lord's call. I mean, I'm sure several of them did, but we should respond as well to the Lord's call to come back. Us who have the hope of the rapture and of the future with Christ, we are to come back to dwell in the land, shall we say, to be with the Lord and to give up whatever blessings we imagine to be out there in the world.